We are we're going to talk about conflict resolution in this session, and we're really going to take everything we've been talking about and we're going to add a little bit to it, but talk about some things hopefully that can help us practically to deal with conflict. We didn't quite get all the way through the last one. We're talking about compromise. We're going to bring that in with this lesson, but basically we're still trying to talk about communicating well, communicating needs and wants honestly and not deflecting or avoiding are all going to be part of not only communicating and being flexible and avoiding conflict, but also resolving it when it comes up. So we're going to kind of meld those things in just a little bit. As we get started on this, there's a couple things I want to start by saying. As we're working through the lessons in this seminar, it's important to remember everything we said in previous lessons continue to roll and apply into the next one. So we're just kind of building on what we have said and what we've talked about. We need to be careful with unrealistic or fairy tale images of marriage. I say this a lot to young couples getting married, but it's still something we should be reminded of. Seeking the perfect can be frustrating and it's unrealistic. There is a lot to be said on that, but because of the makeup of the group here, we're going to not spend as much time on that because, like I said, usually when we're talking to newlyweds or those who are getting married, that's when that really applies. By now, you all have realized that perfect is not really realistic, and that it can be frustrating when you walk into a situation when you have unmet expectations or unrealistic expectations. So now we're really talking about how do we deal with those things when they come up. There will be conflict. Anybody who's been married long enough knows, even if you rate your marriage as a great and wonderful and beautiful marriage, there's still conflict that comes up. There is no perfect relationship where there's never any conflict or dispute or disagreement. And I think it's a little bit of a misnomer, a kind of naming of a good marriage, that people think the people that argue the least somehow have a better marriage. That could be true. That's not always true. Those who resolve their differences well tend to be happier than those who don't, whether they argue a lot or a little. Because some people may not argue very much at all because they don't talk to each other at all. And so that's not necessarily the best thing either. But sometimes we feel like avoiding the conflict is better because if we don't argue, that's a better marriage. And we go all the way back to communication. That's a poor way to communicate. It's not effective. It starts to build distance. We don't build the compatibility, which is not a word we use so far, but that togetherness. We don't build the closeness that we'll be talking about this afternoon after lunch. We don't communicate and deal with compromise. And we are left with that distance and that resentment and that arguing all the time, and nothing seems to be going well, and all of a sudden we're not where we want to be. So all these pieces are necessary combined. It's not like I can do one thing and all of a sudden that makes up for everything else. These are all things that are continual things that we individually grow in. So it's not like I do these things, I don't do these things. We probably all do these things at some point. Whether we do them as we should enough, maybe the question, which we can grow in, or something along those lines. It's not usually an all or nothing kind of situation. How you handle conflicts as they arise will be one of the most important concepts of sustained marriage, happiness, and commitment. So remember on that list I gave yesterday, the very top, one of the top three in almost every one of those is lack of commitment. Someone doesn't feel the other one's as committed to the relationship. Well, it's because they haven't learned how to deal with the conflict. They're avoiding, they're putting them aside, and so on and so forth. All right. For Christians, and that's what we're assuming our status in this conversation, our worldview, if you would. For Christians, the goal of conflict resolution is to be a healthy and stronger marriage but also a godly marriage. So we go back to, and I just put the reference up there. Last night we talked a little bit from Ephesians 5. What did Paul have to say? Marriage in the likeness of Jesus in the church. If we imagine Jesus and how he dealt with the church, that is the attitude and disposition that marriage is supposed to have. You see it first in the idea of submitting. Why submitting? If you think of Philippians 2, verse 5, it says, have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but humbled himself and took on, and made himself of no reputation, taking on the form of a man and coming as a bondservant. Well, what did Paul tell us? He submitted to God. We turned around and talked about husbands, what they're supposed to love their wives as Christ loved the church, not just willing to die for it, but how, and we use the example, in getting up and washing the disciples' feet and not seeing it as a matter of, I could have said this last night, a matter of repetition or reputation rather, or stature or status. In our culture today, we might think, not getting our man card revoked. That's kind of a joke with the younger generation. I don't know if that applies all the way up, but the idea here is that we are not just trying to have a marriage that works in the world, but a marriage that is godly. And those pieces are not inconsistent. Matter of fact, they're more consistent, I think, than any other worldview when it comes to making marriage work. All right, we're going to talk about two concepts, and then we're going to talk about some rules. And this is where we're going to kind of get into the heart of what it means for conflict resolution, what it should look like, and how we can participate in it as far as resolving things and making both parties, or helping both parties to understand and making good decisions. All right, so concept one is honest evaluation. Often individuals and couples can see themselves through rose-tinted glasses. What I mean by that is that we tend to tell our stories with us as the leading role. Do you get that? Does that make sense? And I'm not saying that you're not, because you are kind of the leading role in your story. But it's the way we look at the world. We look at how other people act to us and how we're happy, unhappy, angry, satisfied, whatever it is. And we don't always evaluate it from more of an outside perspective, which keeps us in a biased role. Anytime you have an argument, a disagreement, I'll have students come into the office and, there's some disagreement among the girls, middle school, high school, it doesn't matter. So-and-so is talking this, so-and-so did that. I know right off the bat, I'm going to have two parties that come into my office. Where's the truth of whatever's being talked about going to be found?
Probably somewhere in the middle.
Right? There's person A's story and person B's story, and then there's the truth. And it's not necessarily because they're coming in wanting to purposely distort things, but what are they going to give me? It from their view, right? And that's just reality. So the first thing that we need to make sure we understand, the first concept is we need to try to seek an honest evaluation, which means we're going to have to take a pause. Now, I'm going to suggest something to you that I find very helpful. You might find cheesy, but it's really important to understand. The way our brain chemistry works, emotions trigger and fire faster than our thinking process. When our emotions trigger, we don't think as well. And you know this just by experience. If you really get angry or really get frustrated, it's really hard to think. If you've been, somewhere where you're really sad, maybe a loss, maybe grief, it's really hard to think logically. And you'll hear people say some things that they just don't believe, but it comes out of their mouth. Because their brain chemistry, the way it works, emotions shut down the thinking part of our brain. Okay, so what do we tell kids when they get upset. Maybe they've fallen, gotten hurt, little kid crying, whatever. What do we try to get them to do before they tell us what happened? There you go. Try to get them to calm down. Why? Because when they're trying to talk to us through whatever, it doesn't make any sense, does it? It's gibberish and going on and whatever. When they calm down and bring those emotions back down, they can speak, and they can speak a little better. Well, that doesn't change. We've just gotten better at it as we've gotten older. We've gotten more control over it, but the reality behind it is still the same. So being able to make an honest evaluation, getting outside, sometimes takes us to take a moment to breathe. Now, there's all kinds of breathing exercises out there. You can use them or not use them. Doesn't matter to me, your life, that kind of thing. But they really do, it can be helpful. When you feel very frustrated, anxious, you're having a conversation, things aren't going whatever, or walking into conversation, you're already angry, you take and stop. I find it better if you close your eyes because you're not focused and not distracted. And you take 3 deep breaths. You take a deep breath in, you hold it for a couple seconds and slowly release it, and you do it 3 times. The trick is you have to focus on the air entering into your body. In other words, you focus on feeling the air enter in and leave. As cheesy as it sounds, it does 2 things. In the same moment, but for a moment, your mind gets a break and your body gets a break. So if you just did this, and if I had you do it, you'd feel, if you just followed it and did what thing, you'd feel your shoulders drop. The point is your body relaxes a little bit. Not major, not huge, but just enough. So your body builds up stress. That's why you kind of tighten up. That's why if you've ever been at a stoplight and you start to leave and someone flies through it, and your body just jerks and you hit the brake. That's your natural instinct. Well, your body does that when stress is induced. So cortisol and adrenaline and stuff pumps into your veins, into your body. Your pupils dilate so you can see better. Your ears become, that's why your thinking process kind of shuts down a little bit. You're only focusing on you're more focused on your senses. Well, if your body's tense, it reminds your mind, hey, there's something that's making you tense. If your mind is tense, it reminds your body. So you need that break in both, and I give you. Now, what does that do? Opens up an opportunity to take a breath, let go for a second, and re-enter or enter into the conversation. But it also might be an opportunity when we were talking earlier, when you get mad and you start ruminating over it, and you start thinking about that, and you start whatever about, well, I can't believe it, and you start adding the details and recounting those things, and you start getting more angry or more frustrated, whatever it is, take a breath. And then ask yourself, okay, being more honest, what's happening here, okay? Am I working myself up? Do I really know the details? Am I adding things? Am I interpreting things? Which is a lot more than we can do in one session, but class, but it's the same idea. Second concept, making a plan to deal with conflict. Like I said, there's no couple, unless they've been encouraged to, who starts off saying, you know what, as we get married, we know we're going to face conflict. What's going to be our plan to deal with conflict? Now, if they sit down with me, I'm going to ask them that. And every time they look at me, I've never had a couple say, well, this is the way we'll deal with it. So they enter in because they think love's going to keep us alive, and love's going to be the answer to all of our problems, and we're not going to have any problems because we love each other so much. And then problems come up and conflicts arise. So what's their natural default of how to deal with whatever conflict's in front of them? Maybe. But most likely, whatever they witnessed in their home. Whatever they saw mom and dad do. Whatever they saw their older siblings do. Whatever they saw their grandparents. Whoever had that influence over them and they learned from without ever, saying, sitting in a class like this and having a lesson, but they learned it still the same, more probably deeply than any class could do. But the other person also learned conflict resolution skills. Where'd they learn it? from their home. Each one believes that their way that they deal with things is the right way because they've never even thought to challenge whether it's right, good, bad, helpful, or anything else. It just is. So, obviously, plenty of opportunity for conflict to grow because maybe they lived in a home where, you know what? When there was something wrong, looked like mom and dad just never talked about it. They may have talked about it. They talked about it in their room in private when the kids were in bed. Maybe they avoided it and they were like expert avoiders and they just never dealt with anything. So their default is, if I avoid it, it'll go away. Yeah, I'll just leave her be for a while. She'll get over it after a while and then she'll be fine. She might have had parents that are completely different. They worked out everything at the kitchen table, right in front of the kids, not yelling and screaming, but they worked out, and if there was a problem, they talked about it. They didn't push it off. So she's expecting him to come to the table and to what? Talk about it. When he doesn't come to the table and talk about it, how does she interpret that?
He doesn't care.
Now we add another layer of confusion to the conflict where we're going to have to deal with that and probably the reactions to the emotions going back and forth. And what will most likely happen is the actual thing that's the conflict doesn't even get touched. So concept 1 is honest evaluation. Concept 2 is making a plan. How do we deal with things? We didn't do this well when we got married. We had a simple one. Our idea was we're not going to go to bed mad. I want to say that for the most part we've been able to keep that. And that basically put a time limit on it. It said we're going to have to deal with it before we go to bed, whatever it is. I'm not saying that we always went to bed happy, but it forced us to deal with whatever it was. Now that works for us. That may not work exactly for someone else. But having a plan and having some idea, this is how we're going to deal with conflict, is always, and it doesn't matter if you are a newly married, it matters well. If you've been married 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and you've never really sat down, doesn't mean you can't do it. Doesn't mean you can't go back and say, you know what, I never thought of this, but what do you think would be most helpful when we have a conflict? And let's talk about how we can handle that while we're not in conflict so that we have something to use when emotions are high and maybe our thoughts aren't as strong. All right, those two concepts I think are really good to keep in mind. Let's talk about a few rules. Rule number 1, cooperation. It's very obviously seems fundamental, and it is. But what I mean by cooperation goes a little bit different. I'm going to use the Doctor's Parrot. It's Les and Leslie. They're, again, in that overarching Christendom kind of thought and theme. They're therapists. They write some interesting books. A lot of it, I'll just be honest with you, I find very fluffy. There's not a lot of depth. But they do have some good bits and nuggets inside of that. But I borrowed this from them. So it's not my own idea. But with a goal of fighting for a win-win rather than a win-lose. Okay? If we go into an argument, a discussion, with a desire to win the argument. So me and Craig were mentioning something. He mentioned something about comics a lot of times, kind of going to this. And I mentioned earlier about bad communication taking the dive. And that, you know, you just learn to say yes, dear. Whatever it is, yes, dear. And if it doesn't matter, by all means. But if it's something that you actually care about and you just do the yes, dear thing, eventually you're going to start resentment's going to grow, the conflict's going to expand, and all those things that we were talking about earlier. It's the idea that someone has to win, someone has to lose. Think about that for a second. If I'm going into discussions and conflicts and arguments, whatever they may be, with the idea that I'm going to win or I need to win, I'm necessitating the idea that what's going to be true for my spouse. They're going to lose. Who wants to be married to a loser? Just openly think about that concept. I don't think we carry our thoughts all the way through to the conclusions. Who wants to be married to a loser? As a matter of fact, when it's constantly reinforced and reframed, and then you add other things like friend groups and so forth, kind of becomes an overarching thing for some people. Instead, if we open up that discussion, and again, we're not going to do this perfectly. There are going to be moments where we have that discussion, it just happens. Maybe it's a quick flare-up, someone wins and loses and all that. And hopefully, we would be smart enough and aware enough to go back after everybody's calmed down and say, you know what, I really don't think we handled that well. And this is what I would have liked to have said or liked to have done. So that builds trust and confidence for the next. But anyways, is that we argue or whatever it is with the idea that our marriage wins. It's a win-win. I said last night that the idea all the way back to Genesis was this idea of companionship and helpmeet, and this idea that woman was created for man for that purpose, and I think reciprocally is true. Then that marriage is fundamental, is supposed to be to the benefit of both the man and the woman. If we're fighting and arguing where one's winning and one's losing, I'm not saying that there's not an occasion where that's true. Okay? If, he wants to buy a Harley and jump the Grand Canyon and they're having an argument over that, I hope she wins. And if that she doesn't want him to. But I'm talking about as the attitude and disposition of that marriage. It can't be always, I'm coming into this, I'm going to win. She's going to lose. Or she's coming in, I'm going to win, and he's going to lose. The marriage needs to win. That takes cooperation. That takes some investment. It takes some stepping back and saying, you know what? Let's look at this again. Let me take ownership of what's mine, which we're going to get into here in a second. So that's our first one, cooperation. You've got to work together, which is really hard to do when you're apart on something, isn't it? But knowing that and putting that rule in place might help us do just that. All right. How can we kind of exercise that principle? I'm again going to borrow from the Doctor's Parrot, but they call it holdings. I've heard Gottman calls it the affection bank. We can talk about, I should have brought change with me. I don't have any change. Anybody got pocket change? I use a card anymore. I don't use any change. All right. Do this with leadership all the time too, the same kind of principle. Imagine you start off in your marriage, and we'll call it an affection bank. So that's when you thought the other person did something, it was kind of cute, and then eventually the bank runs out and it's annoying. But you start off with affection, and then you spend it. And you spend it when you make decisions the other person doesn't like, when you say things the other person doesn't like, and it goes out of your hand. The whole idea is that as you all go forward, as you spend, it comes back, and better yet, it comes back with interest. Okay? But what happens when we're not being affectionate, we're not investing each other, we're not communicating, we're not interested in understanding each other, distance is being spent, we're spending everything that we had built up over the course of time, and then we're standing there and we have little to nothing in our hand, and then we're trying to have a reasonable discussion about something. all that in your hands, that's the trust, that's the experience, that's all the different pieces that tells the other spouse, the other partner that you're in this, you're committed, you're going to follow through. And the next thing you know, there's nothing there. So no matter what you say, they don't believe you, they don't have any confidence in it. That's the idea of the holdings exchange. I'm just going to set this right here. Hand it to you after class. Here is one way, you call it preventative medicine, that I think helps conflict. Conflict that's doesn't arise, obviously, is really good, well dealt with, right? Not avoided, as in it's there and we don't want to acknowledge it, but that's kind of diffused before it happens. As an exercise, I use a modified version of this in some counseling, but I think it's really good. It's designating a day of the week. Maybe it's for you, it's Sunday, maybe it's a Wednesday, maybe it's a Friday. It depends on your schedule. I like the idea of a Wednesday night, because it's a good thing maybe to do after you get home from church. But you sit down and you do it weekly, and the idea is that both spouses do it. You write down 2 positive things that you meant to tell your spouse that week, but because the kids ran in, or the doorbell rang, or the phone, you meant to say it, you forgot to say it, you ended up not saying it. Or things that, as you sit back, you should have said. And you write down 2 positive things. Maybe it's as simple as, you know what, I really want to thank you this week for, taking care of the house like you do. I never thank you. I don't think of doing that. I should have thanked you for it. Maybe it's for her. It's, I don't tell you enough that I appreciate how hard you work for our family. Maybe something simple as far as, that lasagna last night was the best one you've ever made. It was just awesome. 2 positive things. Not passive aggressive. Not I love this, or I like this, or this was really good, but. And then you can write 1 negative. So something negative that happened or that you meant to say, and what I mean by negative is it doesn't have that positive thing. Like, I felt like you ignored me, or I felt angry because you overlooked this, or whatever it is. You share those one at a time. The positives, all you can do is reply back, thank you. Okay? So if I was writing it to Tiffany and I said, I was thinking this week and I meant to tell you, but I got distracted, but I really love how you deal with Faith when she's, down. And I saw it again this week. And I want to, she can't say, yeah, but this I do, and this, all she can do is say, thank you. In other words, all she can do is receive the positive. If a negative is shared, again, I'll use us as an example, and I say, I really felt, so use my daughter, because this happens quite a bit, because they're very, very similar, and sometimes similar things don't always get along very well. But, I thought you really escalate that argument. You didn't really need to. I thought you probably should have just taken a breath. I was going to say that, but it was just not the right place, right time. But I want you to know that. She can't respond for 30 minutes. Now, here's the point of it, is to encourage responding rather than reacting or replying. If I walk into a room and I'm angry, and you can tell it all over me, I'm out for my ounce of blood for whatever it is, and I come up to my wife and just I may not even be mad at her, but I'm just mad, and it's just kind of oozing out of me, and I speak to her, and maybe I'm short, whatever, dismissive, whatever it may be. And she notices it, and she tries to say something to me, and I just kind of bark back at her. At that point, do you think she's interested at all and why I'm upset when I bark back at her. Now what is she interested in? How I've treated her. So the conflict doesn't get resolved. The issue underneath, there's nothing there. When we have this holding exercise, she has something to pull from. Say, you know what? I know he's just upset. It's not like he's always upset. You know, he's just it's not even necessarily a straightforward process. It's kind of just happens. There's space there where she can say, just take a minute, or doesn't say it, but just does it. Take a minute and talk to me later when I calm down. That's the whole idea of that building. It's that building of affection. It's last night when I was talking about questions and a conversation and how we talked when we first started dating and early in our marriage versus how we talk now, and that interest and that dreams and all that aspect. That's the same principle. Making sure those things don't get swept out into the nothingness and into the ether, but that are being brought back in so that affection bank builds. So that when we have discussions that are hard, they're there. All right. I'm going to run out of time. Ownership. It's a big one. I say this is my rule in my counseling office. It doesn't matter if it's teenagers. It doesn't matter if I'm counseling outside my office, counseling couples. You need to be willing to take ownership for what's yours to own. I don't ask anybody to take ownership for something that belongs to someone else. But you have to be willing to take ownership for what is yours. Ownership is about the husband and wife taking proper ownership of their piece of a conflict. What tends to happen is, I think my piece is really small, your piece is really big, so I shouldn't have to take responsibility because, look at this. But when I take responsibility, first it's just good character, but when I take responsibility for my part, then you can't use that as a deflection from your part. And that often what happens in conflict. When we get angry, whatever, it's like, how dare you say that to me when you did this, this, and this, and last year you did all this, and then you did, I removed that from you. You have to deal with what is there. And now you can either try to push blame or whatever, but I'm taking ownership. You're right, I did do that. But right now you're doing this. Okay? So taking ownership of what's ours. Now this is really, really important. Not all conflict is actually resolvable. It's like being a Kentucky Wildcat fan and being married to a Cardinal fan. Their family grew up, you love this person to death. Their family is all Louisville Cardinal fans, and you're a Kentucky fan. I've seen it. I know a couple that's that way. It's hilarious to me, you know, just from the silliness of the outside of it, right? Well, are they going to fight in war about their different stances on what team they support? Or are they going to have to learn to live with the fact that they don't both like the same sport or the same team? Well, they learn to live with the fact that they won't, now they have fun with it, with each other, but it's not a point of contention. Now, it's a silly, silly example, but there are going to be things that just aren't resolvable. But that doesn't mean they're not manageable. But you have to have the ability and the investment to make them manageable. All right, I've got 4 of these. I'm going to try to kind of speed up just a little bit. One way to foster this kind of ownership is to avoid criticizing and instead make appropriate complaint. And I want to talk about this idea here really quick. We kind of briefly hit on it. It's not when we're talking about blaming. Have you ever heard the term you and I statements? I'm sure you have at some point. There's all kinds of active listening practices and stuff built on this. I'm just going to share with you the base and why it's important so you can give some thought to it. Again, you won't think to do this every time, but if you can think when you're in one of those conflicts to back up, take a breath, and do this, you might find it changes the discussion. Okay, so generally a criticism starts with you. You always, and that's another big time no. Nobody always, nevers, or evers. That's not a truthful statement. So, but it goes, you always forget to take out the trash. I blamed, I accused, and I also disparaged the person with that statement. That is a criticism. It's not just what they did, but it's them that's been criticized. Instead, if you start with an I statement, and I use this example up here, you always treat me unfairly. You're on the defensive. I've accused you. I've actually attacked your character too. But instead of a complaint, a legitimate complaint, I know it sounds like the same thing, but it's a little bit different. It's the same situation. Might sound like, I feel I don't get a fair opportunity to voice my opinions. And the difference is I start with myself, my needs, my emotions, and my needs. I open up and invite in a thing called empathy. I don't close off and put me on you on an island and let's battle it out. Now, the person can respond and hear underneath that I'm being accused, but they have to make that interpretation. Are you with me? In the moment, it doesn't set off that natural reflect. So it opens up an opportunity to have the complaint heard and to offer a dialogue. Does that mean every time it'll open up a wonderful conversation? No, but it's more productive than starting off with, you always, you don't respect me, you don't whatever. And because of time, I'm going to leave that one for now. Respect. Respecting one's spouse should always be of the utmost priority. There's lots of things that we talk about that along this line. You shouldn't be running down your spouse to someone else. You just shouldn't. If there's something that is wrong, if there's abuse or something like that, I'm not talking about those things. I'm talking about just everyday general things. Look, if you go to a group, and I talk to young people all the time, and you have a group of girlfriends or you have a group of guys that you hang out with, and every time you talk about your spouse, it's about cutting them down or talking about what they do wrong or what annoys you. What's their image of that person now?
They're odd.
Yeah. They don't hold much respect. And then there's a counter consequence to that. When you're going through something difficult, what's their advice going to look like? They don't respect that person. You're not giving them anything to respect. They respect you because you're their friend. Are you going to get honest, information and advice? Are they going to say, well, maybe it's your fault, man. Maybe slow down and take a breath? No. But the best way to build respect is to promote an environment of appreciation. Going back to that holdings exercise, again, things like that. They have multiple facet pieces. Just stopping and saying, pointing out something that you appreciate, rather than always just pointing out the things that you don't or that get on your nerves. You should just avoid being cruel. What is love? Love is kind. It does not behave rudely. Remember? We need to practice that. Studies have shown that happy couples have learned to scan any given situation and look for positives, seek out points of appreciation in the relationship. This practice counters a tendency to bring up negatives. So when we focus on looking for the positive, that's what we're going to get. I'll do this little exercise. We don't have time to do it, but it's called the missing tile. And it would be the same thing. If you were to look up at this ceiling right now, I assume these are individual planks, but if they're not, just go with me. And one of these planks was missing. How long do you think it would take you for you to notice it? Probably not long. I used to do kids in class, the tiles in the ceiling are missing. Your eye is drawn to it because it just should be there. We're just drawn to what we think should be there that's not. That's a negative thought pattern. We don't appreciate how all the other ones look. We're just going to focus on the one that's not there. When you're in communication, you're in a marriage, you're in a relationship, and you're constantly just focused on the negatives, you're not going to see the positives. Well, everything's going to be negative. So making that active opportunity to seek out positive, and this is my last one, is empathy. And I'll just quickly go over this. Empathy and sympathy are cousins, but they're not the same thing. Sympathy is, you've had a bad day, I feel bad for you. You just lost a loved one, you're grieving, I feel bad for you. Empathy is trying to understand why the person would feel or do what they're doing in that moment without judgment. Now, I'm saying that judgment shouldn't be somewhere, but trying to empathize is saying, if I experienced what you did, lived what you did, were in that moment like you are, I might feel what you feel. Now, why is that important? Understanding. And we end where we start. Dwell with them with understanding. Seeking to understand why they would feel. Not why I wouldn't feel that way, but why they would feel in that moment so that I can engage them where they are rather than where I think they should be. It's a principle Jesus exercised. The woman at the well. Beautiful picture. We don't have time to get into it because we're going to go to lunch. John 4. Jesus engaged her where she was, not where he thought she should be or where she needed to be. He eventually got there, but he had some empathy for where she was. And we see that several times throughout Scripture. All right. That's a lot in a little. This is my little summary. Conflict resolution is an important aspect of a strong and healthy marriage. Things brought up in this lesson are intended to build awareness of, to promote a healthy discussion on the topic. Spouses should evaluate what they're doing to promote healthy conflict resolution skills. What are your rules? What have you said that we're going to do when we get into a conflict? You should really have that conversation if you haven't had it. Being able to invest and make, whether it's this exercise of this emotion bank, affection bank, holdings, something that you engage in so that there's positives to draw from, your focus, taking ownership of what is yours to own. It also builds trust that someone else will take ownership of theirs. All these things can help us deal with conflict. And I appreciate your time once again.